Today is August 16th, 2024. We're noticed from 2:10 to 3:40 p.m. We'll start with introductions, starting with George.
George Martinez.
Karen Bronga.
Randy Solt.
Zach Johnson.
Mark Littlefield.
Anna Brawley.
Meg Zalatel. It does not look like we have anyone on the phone. Oh, yes, you are on the other side of the table today.
Scott Myers.
And Mr. Perez Verdia is with us as well.
Hello.
It is Friday afternoon. First names are A-OK. So welcome to today's work session. The title of this session is Presentation on Project Anchorage Sales Tax Proposal, and we'll be hearing from the Anchorage Economic Development Corporation on their proposal to institute a municipal sales tax. I want to remind everyone that the purpose of this work session is to learn from the project sponsors and experts in the field, as well as to give assembly members the opportunity to ask questions and learn more about the legislation in front of us or the topic. This is not a place for debate, and we do not take audience participation, although we do sometimes call for experts from the audience to come forward if we have specific questions for them. Members, please raise your hand if you're in the room and would like to get into the queue. The Anchorage Economic Development Corporation has been working with a group of community members and local businesses to develop a sales tax, and their proposal will soon come to the Assembly for consideration to put on the ballot for voters to decide on the issue. Project Anchorage, proposed by AEDC and a coalition of business leaders, is ambitious, and any major revenue change is complex to navigate. The Assembly sponsors of this initiative have invited Jenna Wright from AEDC to give us a presentation on the topic and to provide Assembly members with the opportunity to familiarize ourselves with this project and put forward questions we might have about the proposal. To Ms. Wright, we know there will be questions today as members begin to explore this proposal. The expectation is that you don't have to have answers for them all, but to start a process and give you and Assembly sponsors guidance on the areas to address in future plans and presentations to the Assembly. We anticipate this will be the first of many conversations between the Assembly and AEDC on this topic, so hopefully this gives us a good jumping off place for those conversations. I'm now going to hand this off to Assembly sponsors of this project, Randy Solt, Scott Myers, and Felix Rivera, if he joins us to give us some background and introduce our speaker. Randy, floor is yours.
Okay, thanks. So I told the team that I would start this off, and I know Felix, when he gets here, wants to speak as to why he is involved in this project. So for myself, it started as the Assembly's liaison to AEDC and probably last year's economic forecast luncheon where the mayor from Oklahoma City came up. Hopefully it was last year, not the year before, but time flies. And just on the 30-year journey that Oklahoma City's been on that he didn't start, probably 4 mayors before him, and just the plight that they were in and how it really transformed that community. And I believe they've passed up to 4 initiatives, which shows that it's working. Also, to me, it's appealing that we need to look at how we can diversify our revenue structure and collect revenue from those that either live outside of the municipality. Kind of where we're at. I don't want to steal any of Jenna's thunder because she's got a great presentation. But from our side, there's the draft AO that's been put together. It's just kind of the nuts and bolts of the process. It still needs a lot of work, but that's been given to Dean for the initial review to make sure that we're not really far off base. It's modeled from language from several past attempts over the years. As Chair Constant has said before, this is a very complex process, complex legislation. And again, just to reiterate, we're here to gather input from everybody so we can make sure that Project Anchorage, should it be approved by the voters, is a big win for the entire municipality, not just Anchorage, not just Eagle River, not just Girdwood. We really want to see that take place. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Jenna, the president and CEO of Anchorage Economic Development Corporation.
Well, thank you, Randy and Meg. It's so great to be here with you all today. As was said, my name is Jenna Wright. I'm the president and CEO of the Anchorage Economic Development Corporation. And I'm really excited to be here today to share details on the Project Anchorage initiative with you all. I'll just reflect back on it's been a journey. We've been working on this for several years. So it's so exciting to finally be in a place where we've got a product that's worthy enough of the Anchorage Assembly. This has certainly been on kind of our milestones for a long time. And so it's very exciting to be here. I'm also joined by 3 members of the broader business coalition that are helping to steer this initiative. So if you 3 would like to introduce yourself, perhaps starting with Michelle, am I right?
Hi, I'm Michelle Clauda. I'm the chair for Anchorage Downtown Partnership. I'm also the vice chair for AEDC. And I'm also a business owner for RIM Architects, a GHD company. So that's.
Hi, I'm Radhika Krishna. I'm the executive director of the Anchorage Downtown Partnership.
Good afternoon, Julie Sapi, President and CEO of Visit Anchorage, and been part of this group since its formation just over a year ago.
Great. Thank you so much. So I'll be walking us through probably about a 15-20-minute presentation today, and then myself and members of the Business Coalition will be available for all of your questions that I'm sure that you will have. And as was said, we'll do our best to answer what we can today, but if we don't have the answers, we'll certainly get them back to you all in a timely manner. So the agenda I have slated for this presentation is to introduce the Assembly to the broader business coalition, define Project Anchorage and the details that are behind it, review where the inspiration came from for a portion of the tax, which was Oklahoma City. We will discuss certainly just a proposed timeline, and then again, most importantly, we'll answer any questions and gather feedback that you all have for us. So although you see myself and Julie and Radhika and Michelle, we are part of a much broader business coalition of other organizations that have been steering this effort. We have small and large businesses. We have business associations that represent construction, hospitality, professional services, Alaska Native Corporation, and more. And these partners have been meeting for the majority of this year. In order to implement a successful sales tax in April is our goal. And in some cases, they've also provided financial resources that have helped us to get to the point where we're at today. Because at the end of the day, this is a very complex change. It's a big change for Anchorage, and we wouldn't be able to do it alone. So we're very grateful to these organizations. So what is Project Anchorage? At its core, Project Anchorage was designed to be a business-backed and community-informed initiative that's aimed at spurring economic growth, lowering property taxes, capturing visitor spending, and improving the overall quality of life for Anchorage residents so that we can retain and attract talent as we find ourselves in really a national competition for workforce, and we struggle with the declining working age adult population in Anchorage. And then at a high level, which we'll dive into more details in subsequent slides, but at a high level, this would be accomplished through instituting a 3% sales tax, 2/3 of which would go to property tax relief, and 1/3 of which would go towards capital projects that make Anchorage an even better place to live, work, and play for all residents, for neighborhoods all the way from Chugiak down to Girdwood. So as Randy mentioned in his opening remarks, our inspiration for the 1/3 for capital improvement projects came from us being really inspired by Oklahoma City's metropolitan area projects, MAPS for short. My personal introduction to Oklahoma City came in the fall of 2022 when a delegation of 20 Anchorage business leaders visited the city. At the time, they were hosting the International Economic Development Council's annual conference. And the 20 of us went down, and what we saw was a very innovative, vibrant city that was experiencing growth and economic prosperity all over this larger city. But we came to learn that it wasn't always like that. Back in the 90s, Oklahoma City was facing very similar challenges to what Anchorage is facing today. They had a collapse in oil prices and a subsequent banking system failure, and their economy was struggling. So young people and their families were leaving. Just a quick story is during that time, in order to kind of pull themselves out of this recession, they put all of their eggs into one basket and they went through this very public bidding process for a United Airlines maintenance center that was supposed to bring 7,500 jobs to the city and help solve a lot of their economic woes. They put together the best incentive package, the best proposal, and by those metrics, they were destined to win this contract. But as part of the evaluation process, United Airlines sent their executives to the city, and the executives said, there is no way that I can bring my family to this city. And so the maintenance center and its 7,500 jobs all went to Indianapolis. And so this was really a pivotal moment for Oklahoma City where they, after this pretty embarrassing experience, they decided to change their destiny from a place that was really struggling to retain talent. And they began to invest in themselves by implementing a 1% temporary sales tax to fund projects that would make the city a better place to live and subsequently retain people. And as a result of those investments that occurred starting in 1993, Oklahoma City has attracted billions of dollars of private investment. Their population is growing year over year, and their economy is absolutely booming. And Randy mentioned they voted the original tax in 1993, and it has been reauthorized by the voters 3 additional times. Most recently with passing with 72% of the vote, which is a testament to how popular this program is to Oklahoma City residents. So I wanted to share just a couple of examples of what Oklahoma City has spent their revenue on, and not to suggest that Anchorage should do these particular projects per se, but just rather to give you some context for our inspiration. So they built on the left-hand side of the screen Scissortail Park, which is right next to downtown. It's a 70-acre urban park that has an amphitheater. It's got a performing arts stage. It's got trails. When we were there, it was very, very hot, and there was a splash pad that young kids were really enjoying. And yes, it's just great. It's activated very, very well, and it was very popular. They also built an innovation district that we got the chance to tour, and it serves as a small business development and entrepreneurship hub. And it also has a biopharmaceutical workforce training center and an innovation hall with community space on site that attracts innovators from all over the country to collaborate on respective initiatives. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, this is a traditional civic center that was built with the dreams of attracting a national-level sports team. And this arena has been home to the Oklahoma City Thunder since 2008, which is a significant driver for their downtown area. And then the photo on the left is an example of why we feel like it's so important to get the community involved in selecting Anchorage's projects. So in Oklahoma City, they had a river on the outskirts of downtown, and it didn't have the nice green riverbank that you see in the photo. At one point, it didn't even have water in it. They had diverted the water, and there was literally a line item in their budget to mow the dry riverbank at that point. But one of the residents was a rafting athlete and noticed that there was like this 1 mile perfect stretch of river that could be used for racing. And so they submitted a proposal to build a man-made whitewater rafting kind of feature on the side of the river. And they also have a beautiful boathouse facility in this area as well. So they got water back in the river. They really built this area up, and now it serves as a place for Red Bull to do all kinds of competitions, like whatever fun thing is happening in this photo. And they're also the host of the 2024 Olympic trials, or they were earlier this year. And so just an example of the creativity that we're trying to replicate from the Anchorage community with the online project submission portal that we have in place. So bringing the story kind of back home to Anchorage, once we got back from the trip, we couldn't stop talking about it and how revolutionary this program was and how Anchorage was really primed to do something similar. And eventually, as Randy alluded to, it caught the attention of a few of our assembly members who said, hey, I really like this Oklahoma City idea, but if we're going to do a sales tax, we should have a component of property tax relief as well, which was something that AEDC certainly agreed with and recognized as a critical need. So In 2023, in order to develop the structure that we are recommending today, the AEDC Board of Directors convened a ad hoc sales tax committee that was charged with debating the merits, the structure, what the appropriate exemptions would be for a sales tax in Anchorage. And after a series of 7 meetings last summer, the committee produced a comprehensive sales tax recommendation report that really informs the work that we're doing today. Later that fall and then through the beginning of this year, we started to work with private businesses and business organizations that you saw on the coalition slide to start to gather support for this initiative and ask folks to join the business coalition and help us to drive it forward and implement this initiative that's ultimately modeled around both Oklahoma City maps, yes, but also Project 80s. We've done this once before when we built the Sullivan Arena, the library, the Anchorage Museum, the Performing Arts Center that you can see on the right-hand side of the slide. And so while we certainly took inspiration from Oklahoma City's success, the Project Anchorage proposal is really tailored to the specific needs that we feel that Anchorage has today. And a lot of work has gone into this proposal. So here's a more in-depth look at the timeline of the work that's been done so far, and this goes back to before my time at AEDC and what I showed on the last slide. So there was an original trip to Oklahoma City in 2015 where members of the mayor's administration at the time, the business community, and different nonprofit organizations went just to observe maps. And then 1 year later, Oklahoma City leaders came to Anchorage and met with Anchorage leaders to do a more in-depth discussion about what a MAPS-like program would look like for Anchorage, and they shared all kinds of lessons learned and things along those lines. Then in 2022, the next delegation that most of us were a part of traveled to Oklahoma City for the second time, and that really served as a catalyst for this second round of interest in MAPS. And then 1 year later, we brought up former Mayor Mick Cornett, who really oversaw MAPS 3 and part of MAPS 4. But really had lived in Oklahoma City for the entire MAPS program and had a lot of lessons learned that he was able to share with us over his experience in the past 30 years of MAPS. Then I already mentioned that in the summer of 2023, the AEDC Board of Directors convened the ad hoc committee, and we engaged with the University of Alaska Center for Economic Development to analyze the amount of revenue that would bring in, and we produced that comprehensive report that was used to kind of recruit folks into a more comprehensive business coalition full of supporters. And we've been meeting biweekly for the majority of the year, and we have just recently begun to form subcommittees where we're recruiting additional folks to help us start to select some projects and then go through a costing exercise so that we have a rough order of magnitude that we can use to essentially select some final projects that go to the ballot. Okay, so now that you understand the backstory, let's dive into the 2 different aspects of the proposal. As a reminder, from a high level, it's a 3% sales tax, 2/3 for property tax relief, and then 1/3 for capital improvement projects. So our first recommendation is that there is property tax relief, and our motivation for this section is really trifold. I know the Anchorage Assembly is very much aware that Anchorage is in the midst of a housing crisis, and while it's difficult to immediately affect the lack of supply, cost of labor, land availability, and struggles like that, one thing that we could change relatively quickly are the property taxes that we pay. And so with this portion of the tax, our goals are to increase housing affordability, reduce the cost of doing business, and capture visitor spending towards the municipal services that out-of-state visitors and commuters are enjoying but don't currently pay for. And so this would just be a dollar for dollar under the cap exchange that doesn't result in any new revenues to the municipality, but instead of coming from property owners, the same amount of revenue would come from sales taxes, reducing Anchorage's tax burden by roughly $120 million per year, resulting in an estimated tax break of about 20%. And very quick math would say that on average, that's about $100 off the monthly mortgage payment of an average house in Anchorage. Now, the remaining 1/3 would be modeled very closely to Oklahoma City. The sad reality is that our beautiful city has been losing working age adult population for over a decade, and that's a significant economic concern. In the national labor market environment that we find ourselves in and will likely remain in for quite some time, talent is really looking across the country and finding a place that they want to live based on their lifestyle needs. And then they're choosing a job from there because jobs are in abundance from pretty much across this entire country right now. And so our business coalition is really passionate about making Anchorage a place that's worth choosing, as we do find ourselves in this challenging national competition for workforce. And we understand that in order to attract businesses, investment, and talent, we need to invest in ourselves first. And that's what this portion of the tax aims to do. So the 1% would result in an approximate $60 million in new annual revenue above the current municipal tax cap that would go towards specific quality of life infrastructure projects that are coming from the community of Anchorage. And so what we mean by that is that we're currently in the process of collecting ideas from all over Anchorage through an online portal at projectanchorage.com. And when the portal closes, we're going to be going through a project selection process that includes some polling so that we can figure out what is most attractive to the population of Anchorage. And then we'll go through a costing exercise to determine, which ones are financially feasible and how many we can fit into the ultimate budget. We would then pass that information over to you all as the assembly to deliberate and make final decisions on which projects would go to the final ballot ultimately. And then one more benefit of a sales tax is that everybody pays for it, even those that don't live here. Right now, as I know this body is aware, the majority of Anchorage's municipal revenues come from property owners. And we believe as a coalition that it's really important to diversify our revenue streams and start collecting revenue from visitors, both in terms of out-of-state visitors, but also the thousands of people that are commuting into our city on a daily or weekly basis. So at current tourism levels, our research indicates that at least 20% of the tax would be paid for by people that don't live here. And we actually have reason to believe that that number is actually quite conservative, and it would likely be higher than that. On this slide, I want to point out that we did debate the exemption structure quite robustly in our 2023 committee meetings, because a common argument of a sales tax is that it's regressive for lower income households that spend a larger portion of their wages on essential items. And that can certainly be true, especially if the exemptions aren't properly accounted for. And so the ad hoc committee that developed the structure of the tax considered best practices from other communities in Alaska, as well as communities in the lower 48, and ultimately recommended the set of exemptions that we felt best addressed the issue of regressivity. And so we recommended that non-prepared foods at the grocery store, medical care and supplies, rental housing, financial services and transactions, gasoline, childcare, and childcare products all be exempt. And then we also recommended a cap on the amount of each transaction that would be taxed of $1,000. Ultimately, certainly this final slate of exemptions is certainly up to the assembly to approve, but this was our committee's recommendation. Okay, so as far as next steps, we've got a lot of work to do between now and the end of the year. But right now, our current focus is to get as many project ideas as we can from all of the nooks and crannies of Anchorage. We are currently working on doing things like a community council roadshow. We're going to Rotary clubs. We're going to association meetings. We do have some paid advertisements running on social media, encouraging folks to submit project ideas. And we're really telling everyone that, whether you love or hate the idea of a sales tax in Anchorage, please do give us projects so that we can ensure that we are meeting the desires of the broader Anchorage public. In particular, we want to hear from the people that notice that 1 mile stretch in the river, which is things that, we wouldn't come up with as a coalition, and maybe this body wouldn't either. So we really want those creative ideas to come from the people of Anchorage. The portal will be open through September 15th. So we're on the 1-month stretch right now. And so after we gather up all of the project ideas, our plan is to do another round of polling where we can, again, just kind of determine which ones are most widely popular. And then we envision passing along those most popular ones to the assembly with some due diligence on the costing side of things. And then that's up for your consideration, review, and ultimate approval of a final slate of projects. And then as far as our involvement with the assembly, we've put together this proposed timeline that's on the screen, and we're certainly happy to augment this in any way that you all see fit. But what we're thinking is that we would start with this initial assembly work session that we're in today. Then in September, Assemblymember Salt and the other co-sponsors would introduce an ordinance with another work session to discuss the details on that. And then in October, we would have another work session to discuss the specific projects that rose to the top of the polling and costing exercise. And then finally, we would have another work session in November. And at that time, we hope to have delivered enough compelling information for you to approve the ordinance of a sales tax proposal to be in the ballot in April for the consideration of Anchorage voters. And then once we have that final ballot proposition with the slate of selected projects, the Business Coalition would then pivot our focus to running a really robust educational campaign that ensures a yes vote in April with the public of Anchorage. Okay, great. So that was kind of the end of my presentation. I will say just one more thing before I turn the floor over is, we wanted to address one additional fact, which is that we understand that a sales tax in Anchorage is certainly a challenging thing to pull off. We understand that it has been tried and failed a few times in the past, but we feel like there are some key differences in our proposal. And one of those things is that the business community is really engaged with this initiative. We've got a remarkably strong coalition of businesses and business leaders that have been volunteering their time and financial resources to make this proposal a reality. And we know that it's going to take a really rigorous campaign with credible backers to get something like this done. And that's why we're so excited to have such a strong foundation to build upon. The other thing is that we've done research to confirm which elements of a tax that Anchorage voters will support, and the results are really encouraging. Our research shows that although voters reject a generic sales tax or one that just goes towards general government funding, this specific proposal is supported with a 14-point margin. So that tells us that this is a winnable campaign, and it's a proposal that is ultimately attractive to Anchorage voters. So with that, thank you so much for your time. I will hand the floor back over to the chair, and we're happy to answer any questions.
Great. I'm going to turn it over to Felix. Felix joined us a while ago. We're using first names because it's Friday afternoon.
Oh, okay.
Because he wanted to give some initial remarks, and then we'll turn to the queue.
Great. Thanks so much, Meg. So a few opening remarks. I just wanted to talk a little bit about why I'm coming to this project, how I have engaged in this, and my sort of hopes and dreams. So sit down and sit back. I first engaged in this actually in I think it was early 2022, where folks had started sort of percolating the idea of sales tax. And a lot of people were saying, well, if a sales tax is going to come forward, it shouldn't come from the assembly, it should come from the mayor. That's when there was that sort of very binary discussion. And so I said, okay, fine. Let me meet with the mayor and see if the mayor at the time was interested in a sales tax. And what I proposed to the mayor was some kind of sales tax that does both both some amount of property tax relief and funding for critical municipal services, things like public transit, housing, those kinds of things. Not too surprising, the mayor was not interested in that discussion, and so moved on to my 2023 reelection. And I was not shy during my 2023 reelection that we need to have a conversation about a sales tax as a community, that I felt like we were ready for that conversation as a sales tax as a community. So every forum that I attended, everywhere that I was going, I was not shy about saying sales tax. So after I won my reelection, I started talking to folks about, okay, well, now I gotta keep that campaign promise. So let me start talking to folks about who's thinking about a sales tax. So I talk with Bill Popp, former CEO of AEDC, and get introduced to the idea of MAPS. And really from there, I was engaged in that AEDC committee before it became the coalition, gave them my advice, was frank with the coalition that the assembly is finicky. I don't think anyone would be offended by that. We all know we're a finicky group. And that this is going to take a significant amount of time to go through the assembly process, that we should not feel any kind of ego about the product that we eventually turn over to the assembly, because the assembly is probably going to tear it to shreds, right? So I was very upfront with folks about that from the very beginning. But I think in the end, the reason why I signed on to that and am supportive of the effort is because I see really the potential, much like what happened in Oklahoma City, for us to look at different ways we can revitalize the municipality, not just downtown, which I know there is, a lot of focus in downtown, but revitalize the municipality from Chugackigo River to Girdwood, and not just capital projects, which I know that this first phase is focused primarily on capital projects, but we all know when we talk in different meetings that there is just so much need for services, and how the heck are we going to pay for services? So, that is the frame that I am coming at this from, is thinking in the future, different iterations of this tax, if voters continue to approve it, what it could do and how it could really improve our municipality. So that's the frame of reference that I have come to this from. I will say, primarily because I really wanted this to be from a community-driven process, that once it did turn over to the coalition, that I really stepped back. So I have not engaged as much in a lot of the work since the coalition started gearing up. Thanks.
Thanks, Felix. All right, we've started a queue. So Miss Karen, you're first.
Thank you so much. So that Felix may have answered my question there. So when you mentioned capital projects, is that the only thing you're entertaining on this round? Because we have a constituent that has an absolutely amazing non-capital idea that I was very supportive of. So that's the first question. And the second question, the non-prepared foods at grocery stores. I was a health teacher, and I would really love to see high fat, high salt, high sugar foods be part of the ones that receive taxing. I think every time I see a child walking down the street with a big gulp in their hands, I want to jump out of my car and grab it from them. But if we could add those kinds of things into being taxed, I don't know if that's what you meant by non-prepared. I was kind of thinking you were talking about food court type things would be taxed, but regular groceries would not. But if we could look at maybe junk food.
Thanks for those questions. So on non-prepared foods, the intent of the coalition was all non-prepared foods at the grocery store, regardless of their nutritional content. What would be excluded is like if you got a sandwich from the deli that's been prepared and it's more of like a Subway item kind of thing. But I will certainly take that feedback back to the coalition. So thank you for that. And then on your question on capital projects, we've not, I would say, like, we're not married to a specific arrangement of how large certain projects are and how small certain projects are. We are, like I said, modeling this after Oklahoma City, and they had great success in doing some of these larger capital projects. But we've had conversations about maybe we have 3 anchor projects and then some smaller projects that are included as well. So I would say submit all of your ideas right now, because the one other thing that we've kind of talked about is that there's the potential to combine smaller projects that make up one larger transformational project as well, that helps to that helps to attract different private investment and subsequent economic development in an area as well. So submit them all at this point. And Michelle had.
Yeah, if I may. So, I think when we're looking at these projects, we're looking at a breadth of projects, and some of them may be more low-hanging fruit that we can immediately have, a turn back into the community. So one of the projects that was submitted was a municipality-wide mural project. And that's more on the lower hanging fruit. It's not going to be a $60 million project. And that's really ideal. And, one of the kind of the historical context of Oklahoma City, which is really intriguing to me, and I don't know if we've really gotten into the depth of discussion of it, it started with very large public recreation and play projects. And this MAPS 4 now is focused on youth centers, senior wellness centers, homelessness, addiction. So it's starting to become more of a, okay, let's put these glitzy projects out. And then now let's turn in and start focusing on fixing some of the challenges in our community and providing support and services for that. And schools was one of them prior to this MAPS 4, was a focus on schools. And so, I don't know what that would look like here in Anchorage and what the voters would really want to focus on. But there's this really beautiful idea that it can transition into something a lot more and meaningful.
Great, thank you. I have myself, then George, then Anna. Wave me down if you want in the queue. My question is, how will this increase housing affordability for renters? What I understood here is that it would take money off your mortgage, but we don't usually see tax incentives or tax breaks passed on to renters. And we know that we have an affordability issue with rent. So how will this do that?
Yeah, great question. I think from our perspective, we are realistic in thinking that it's not going to be an immediate benefit for renters. It's more likely that it would put downward pressure on rents rising even more exponentially over time. But really, it would increase housing affordability for those that own property at this time, most likely.
Great. And as a follow-up offline, if you guys have any research about the effects for renters, I would really like to see it. I think that's a really important component when we hear renters kind of stuck and stuck in the market where they're at. So appreciate that. George.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Meg. Friday. Just a couple of clarification questions that popped up as you did your presentation today. So thank you all for being here. Why was Oklahoma picked as the comparative city?
So was anyone part of the original 2015? No? Okay. Well, from what we understand, when they saw Oklahoma City, they were just really impressed by it. And I can speak from our experience, like Michelle and Julie and I went down in the 2022 delegation, and we saw the transformative effect. We saw the way that the entire community really bought into the success of their city, to the point where we were in a cab going from the airport to the hotel, and the cab driver said, "We did this." In other words, they just had such buy-in to the projects and the success of their city. So we were just very inspired by that, and we also felt like it was a replicatable mechanism, right? It's relatively simple on its face. Certainly it can get complicated, but we were just very inspired by that. Would either of you like to add to that? Julie, go ahead.
I think initially Oklahoma City had developed a national reputation for this project specifically. So it kind of bubbled to the top when people were looking for models of how to reinvest in a community. It really has a large national following and lots of accolades. And I think the people from Oklahoma City are probably tired of traveling around teaching communities how to do this. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to follow up on a couple of these clarifying questions. I asked that because I'm interested in a little more of the data comparative analysis versus the anecdotal feeling analysis. Mm-hmm. And I'll give you an example. Oklahoma City is more than twice the population size of Anchorage. Oklahoma City is 3 hours from Kansas City, other high traffic cities on the road system. And so, and it's home to an NBA team, right? So it seems like there are some fundamental differences between the marketplace of Oklahoma, what they've been able to accomplish. And I'd just be interested in the data points that demonstrate why it would be effective here in a comparative way to Oklahoma City. Because I also did the comparative to Indianapolis, and Indianapolis is about 3 times bigger than Anchorage, which is bigger than Oklahoma City. So, you know, I want to see apples to apples, oranges to oranges comparisons as best as I can. Just following that thread as well. I really appreciate you mentioning the idea of the starting point projects. And it seems that that they had a range of early projects that had a focus outward. And then you described it. I would love to kind of have that clarity of all of those different projects across the different tiers as well. Because I think that's important to get a contextualization of, you know, if you're in a comparable city that has an NBA team with the road, will a whitewater rafting attraction draw people? Possibly, right. But I don't know that that's necessarily going to be the same level of comparative analysis to a draw for our community, right? So we may, in fact, be the other part of the coin is maybe we're in tier 4 to start, which means how do we maintain the things we already have? Because if we love Anchorage, the people who love it here, then that's the message that goes out. That's the message that you heard when you got there. But the comparative units seem different, and I would just love to learn a little bit more about that. And then we'll close. I'm also interested in how you all have come to the estimated revenue. I'm interested in those data analysis, how you come to the estimated revenue, how you project 20%. So do you all have that available now?
We do, and we'd be happy to supply it. We work with the University of Alaska Center for Economic Development to do that analysis, and we can certainly provide that to the Assembly. And I appreciate your feedback on the comparative analysis. One thing I do want to point out is that when Oklahoma City started this back in the 90s, they were a lot smaller than they are today. Their population has increased by 40%, and they were at well under 500,000 back then.
Yes, I recognize, but they also have always been on the road system. Like, so comparatively, we are a very different space. And I think that's really the main point that I'm trying to drive, which is it seemed that there was a model picked from a place that I don't know necessarily I don't think there's any place directly comparable to Anchorage. But if we are going to model something, then I would love to see the comparative analysis as best as we can. Yeah, I'll wait into the queue and come back around.
Okay. Yep. Thanks,
you.
George. As you get kind of all these requests for information, if we could send them back through our legislative services staff, that way they can go to all members, that would be really great. Because I think all members are probably wanting the same types of information and don't want to repeat themselves. So next, Anna.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for the presentation. I guess I have 2 kind of general categories. So I'm interested your guys' thoughts now, and then I would be happy to follow up. One is on, you invoked Project 80s, which was both a great project for a city and also has left us a lot of legacy problems, right? So I'm wondering how much discussion there has been about operating costs of these projects. And I'm going to point to, on the one side of the street over here, we have the PAC, which was built in the 1980s, does not really have an operating revenue structure outside of its own programming. And we had to emergency fund replacement of an elevator that the soonest possible we could do it was putting it in, basically not even having to put it in the budget, right? So there's no really planned capital other than going and asking the state for money for that or trying to do a bond. Then on the other side of the street is the Denina Center, which has been so successful that it has a multi-million-dollar savings account, but is really was built in a way that does care for those operations, and I think has been more successful than the original structure allowed, right? Because there was most convention centers just break even. So those are 2 extremes, obviously, but they're on either side of F Street, so it's an interesting contrast. I just wonder, when you talk about Project 80s, how have you talked about not replicating those legacy problems?
We have certainly acknowledged that there needs to be some sort of mechanism built in to where we don't build a shiny new building and then, just allow it to go into disrepair. And I think a lot of the specifics will depend on which projects are selected. And it might even factor into whether or not it's something that's chosen as part of MAPS 1. To whether or not it can be maintained properly. So we certainly have talked about it, but it's tough to say exactly how that would be approached until the projects are to the point of being selected or even shortlisted. And Radhika, go ahead.
Yeah, I do just want to add that one general point is that I think our intention was never that this project solves every issue that we have in our community. This cannot solve maybe our housing crisis or our need for public service funding, but we think we can do one thing well, which is capital funding. And I will say there are some cases in which capital funding can reduce operating costs. One of the proposals, if it's okay, that I share is for a Kincaid facility redevelopment where there would be a lot more earned revenue through equipment rentals and things like that, where an operator could come in. So those are the types of projects that we do think could be transformative. And I think we would love to work with you on how those models could apply to other public facilities.
I would love to add two things. One of the ways that it seems like Oklahoma City has had success in some of their continuing operation of these facilities, that they've partnered with nonprofit organizations to take over the facilities, and then they're responsible for continuing and running. And so I don't know how that would work here, but that is one option. But they have also created a fund specific to continuing to operate these facilities. And we haven't had a chance to really dive deep into that. And I think that that's probably where we need help from the assembly and from the city on what that actually means and how that gets integrated into things. And so there are opportunities there instead of just continuing to put burden on the city for operating costs.
Thanks. Go ahead, Anna. You have a follow-up.
Yeah, thanks. And yeah, I appreciate it. It would depend on the project. I think just making sure that that's always part of the conversation, especially when you talk about Project 80s, because there's two sides to that story. The other question I have generally is when we talk about taxes, a word I learned in the last year was distributional effects. So who pays, and then if there is a lesser burden on one population or group or category, it can shift to the other, right? And then we've talked about kind of the structural issues of that. So my two specific questions are, why have a cap on transactions? So you mentioned that $1,000 transaction cap, because I do have some heartburn about that. And then just to make sure that I understand, when you talk about 20% property tax relief, is that just residential property owners or is it all property owners? And maybe you can unpack that a little. Thanks.
So the answer to your second question is it would be for all property owners in the municipality. And then maybe if one of you ladies want to add on to this explanation, but we debated that cap pretty robustly at the committee level last summer, and ultimately we kind of, there were some people that wanted it to be lower, there were some people that wanted it to be higher, and $1,000 was kind of the compromise that the committee came to. And I think what we were trying to do is we looked around the state of Alaska, and we tried to find what other cities were doing and kind of like mirror some of those best practices so that we weren't disproportionate to other cities. And then they were, kind of playing the game of like, okay, well, I'm not going to buy a car in Anchorage. I'm going to go out to the valley or, somewhere else to do that. So we didn't want to affect consumer spending in that way and make it so larger purchases like a car or a boat or a snow machine were, it just was an added expense on top of that already expensive thing. And Michelle, you want to add to that?
Well, I think, Anna, you had add a part one to the question on looking at the analysis of how the distribution of the burden falls.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Sorry, I did miss that part. Thanks for the point or the prompt there. So we are in the process of getting even more in-depth research from ICER right now. So we worked with the Center for Economic Development last summer, and now ICER is in the process of validating that research, but then in particular, looking at how the tax would affect households at each decile. And so they would see a property tax reduction of X, but they would pay a sales tax of Y. And so is that proportionate across the household spectrum, or is it out of whack? And if so, where and how can we make changes to address that?
Great. We'll look forward to that information as well. I'm going to go to Mr. John, or sorry, to Zach, and then to Cameron because they're next in queue.
Yeah, thank you. So you talked about maps 1, 2, 3, 4. Could you expand a little bit on sort of what those time cycles look like? I mean, what portions of the tax are subject to renewal on a recurring basis, and kind of how that informed your decisions and what you envision for Project Anchorage in terms of, how often would it come up before voters for consideration?
So Oklahoma City, as we've mentioned, has had 4 different iterations of maps, and I don't remember exactly how long the timeline was for each of the 4, but I'm happy to follow up with that information. But from a high level, they essentially chose a time period, and I believe the first one was about 5 years is what they did. And so they basically collected the sales tax for 5 years. They had a budget where they knew that they could build these particular projects with that budget. At the end of the 5 years, they asked voters if they wanted to reauthorize it for another specified timeline to fund these particular projects, which would be MAPS 2. In this case, as Michelle mentioned, that was MAPS for Kids, where they went through and they renovated all of their schools. But yeah, that's how it worked. And we've not coalesced around a specific time frame here in Anchorage or anything like that. But that's the way that Oklahoma City did it. And I can get those time frames for the assembly.
And would that be for just the 1% piece or for the whole sales tax in its entirety?
That is one question that's kind of open-ended right now. We kind of touched on it last year, but it's still, again, open-ended, and that would be a conversation that we would love to have with the assembly to find an area, what that number is or what the temporary nature of it is and what makes sense for Anchorage.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. Cameron?
Yeah, it sounds like we're already. I think I'm asking the same question just in a different way. But I'm also interested in the choice to do 2/3 property tax, 1/3, and the rationale behind that, and how much of that is about it being a really effective economic model versus it something that is passable in terms of the campaign, and and just sort of the basis for that, and it strikes me as odd that we would create a tax to reduce a tax. So I guess what I didn't hear is whether that is the model that Oklahoma City has, and if that's exactly what they're doing to sort of use a tax to reduce a tax, and whether sort of from an economic standpoint that has worked, and the other piece is I think just from a taxpayer's perspective, what's my sort of security that this won't change, right? That this is not just an entry point into starting a tax, and then the tax will shift over time, and so So those are the things that are on my mind, but I guess I don't have a real clear sense as the clear rationale behind the percentage and what's that based on, and if Oklahoma City is a model that proved that to be economically effective.
So Oklahoma City didn't approach their first maps by combining property tax relief like we are recommending that we do in Anchorage, but they also weren't in the top 10% of property tax paying cities at the time. They already had their revenue diversified, and so they approached it with just that 1% for maps. That was another point that our committee really debated last year was, should it be 1% or 2% or 3% for property tax relief? And ultimately, I think some of the rationale behind the 2% was that it was meaningful. You could actually feel the property tax relief from a 2% reduction, and that was going to be important for the proposal to be attractive to a large portion of Anchorage voters. And
attractive from the perspective of it reduces my property tax, or from the perspective of it distributes the burden differently. Does that make sense? So it brings more people into the process as opposed to, is it both?
It is both, yeah. And Radhika, it sounds like you have a couple.
Yeah, I want to address the question about how do I know that it won't change? I've been presenting at community councils, and that is probably the most common question that I've gotten. And that's something that we don't really have the expertise to figure out outside the municipality. I would say that's really one of the asks is what is the structure in terms of board or office within the municipality that gives people faith that this will be enacted the way that people intended.
Okay, thank you. I'm back in the queue, then George, then Anna. I have two questions. One is to share anecdotally when we had federal relief dollars and we were able to buy hotels to convert them to housing, we could not give them away to nonprofits and had to create an entity in order to do that. Capital dollars are always easier to raise than operations dollars. And when we talk about things like senior centers, love that idea, or medical clinics or anything that's services based, operations dollars are always going to be a concern unless there's some built-in ongoing mechanism for those. So just as we think about what the projects could look like, I think that that's a real consideration. So I guess not a question, just a comment. The question I do have, and it was based off of what Felix said, was how comfortable are you all when like we get our hands on this? Because you're proposing to run a robust campaign, but what if it doesn't look like what you're proposing? Why? So you can take that question either that way, or you can take it as why not run this as a citizens initiative?
I think we're fully prepared for the final product to look different than it does today, and we would just need to have that conversation with the business coalition if it changes fundamentally what we support. So I mean, we certainly want to work with the assembly very much. You all are elected representatives of your district, and we want your feedback, and that's why we're here today, and why we've been working through this process in the way that we have. So we're very open to being flexible. There's very few things that we are like, it has to be exactly this way. So I just want to make sure that that's understood for sure.
Thanks for that. If you do have hard stops, knowing those up front, if those would prevent a campaign from moving forward, I think are important to know, because I am loath to put something on a ballot that doesn't have a campaign to go with it. Lesson learned. Go ahead, Michelle.
I think the coalition is sensitive to the fact that we as businesses are putting our own money into this. And so we do want to run a campaign that's going to be, aligned to a degree with what comes out of the assembly from this. And I think our schedule for actually like campaigning for when it gets onto the ballot doesn't start until January of 2025. And so, we're hitting this Project Anchorage projects portion really hard right now, but we've kept the rest of it pretty quiet, knowing that we still have a lot of work to do with you guys to really build this.
Thank you. George.
Thank you, Meg. A couple additional follow-ups. Why is it not, or have you explored the opportunities or the ways to make this exclusively for a tax on visitors? And how do you accomplish that? And have you talked, presumably you have explored that.
Do you want to go ahead?
I think once the property tax relief became part of the conversation pretty early, no, but we did talk a lot about, in fact, just the opposite. Should, say, hotels be exempt since they're already collecting a tax from visitors? And we did not exempt hotels because we wanted, this is part of the diversifying of the economy of the tax base. And we thought that would also be appealing to Anchorage voters to know that not just our out-of-state visitors, but our commuters would be contributing to this tax. And, but we did not, and we talked about seasonality too. And I think what really, as we started looking at the research that ICER was doing, is realizing for this to raise enough money that we could do really cool things, it had to be much more broad-based than just our visitors. And we wanted community buy-in to the project. So I think there were a few reasons.
Cool. Just to follow up on I think I heard you say that once property tax relief was involved in the formula,
Yes.
it necessarily changed that trajectory. I think I heard that.
I
Unless that was a miscue.
Yeah, I think that the combination of the two,
What I'm asking is,
Yeah.
is there some degree of protecting what you described as people who you may see as like visitors who are already
Mhm.
being taxed, and the diversification as you describe as like we all are part of
Yeah.
the formula?
there was discussion about protecting, I guess, the visitors from additional taxes. And in the end, we are like, no, they should be part of this.
But they are protected to the extent that we only expect 20% of the revenue to be generated from them.
Correct.
Okay.
They're paying the same 3% that residents pay.
Just a couple other clarifications. Anything offline that people want to just respond back to me, feel free to do that as well. What do you say to, and we've heard this at community councils, but what are you all saying to the argument that we don't know how to take care of what we already have? We've built beyond our means, and primarily because when we talk about Project 80s, we're not only talking about municipal dollars. You're talking about a whole different funding stack from feds, oil companies, and state dollars coming into the municipal pool, right? And so it seems that the economic environment is very, very different than it was in the past. What do you say to those folks who say, we don't have the ability to take care of what we already have? What are we doing looking to do more stuff? And it goes back to kind of what Anna mentioned before. Thank you.
You want to? Yeah, I mean, it's an important question. And I think one of the trends that has come up, or lines of thinking as we're thinking about these projects, is where are we selecting? And let's be intentional about that. Kincaid was mentioned earlier as a potential site for a brand new upgraded facility that's got, 4 seasons access. That's a site that already needs maintenance. And so if we can be intentional about where we're doing these things and kind of take care of 2 problems at once. That's one thing that we're looking at. The other one was we don't want to make some of these same mistakes that we've made in the past where we didn't include maintenance and operations and things like that in the overall equation. So we're trying to be mindful about that as well. And then I think, at a very basic level is, it's impossible to ignore some of the struggles that we have with housing and homelessness. So why are we trying to build new things now when we have these other problems? And I think, do we want to solve those problems as well? Of course, but do we want to do it as part of a growing city that's able to retain and attract talent? Or do we want to do it as a city that's continuing to not have investment in itself and unfortunately a dying city? And so we really looked at, we want to solve all of these things for Anchorage, but we want to do it as a growing city that's able to retain and attract our talent.
Thanks. Anna.
Thanks. Clarifying question, and then one other bigger question. So you mentioned, Julie, the saying not exempting hotels. So we have a 12% bed tax. Is that proposing that this 3% is on a hotel room in addition to the bed tax? Okay, thank you.
She says yes. We have to get it.
Yeah, okay.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks. So I think that would be a question too, is how does that interact with our, because it is in the charter, right? And it says that we have a tax. So that's just something to flag for you guys to look into. I'm not saying I oppose or support that, just that's a new piece. And then to the kind of coalition folks or those who've been going out and talking to people, I'm curious kind of what the opposition has been. And I want to characterize that not so much as individuals who are skeptical, because certainly you'll hear that from community councils and so on. But having gone through the alcohol tax, which is another tax that people for decades said would never happen until it did in this city, right? So that, there's their lesson there. But major retailers, grocers, Walmart, the big players, the big international players really in our city, the hospitality industry, the cruise industry. And I mention those because I see that you have a really great mix of folks in your coalition. You can't have everybody in it. But the reality is that when we proposed a bed tax in Anchorage, Alaska, Budweiser Corporation was in our grill, more or less, right? So it is important to at least suss out where these folks are, because they do throw a lot of weight around. And also they have a business in every other community that has a sales tax already. So I am skeptical of their arguments, whatever they're going to bring. I'll just say that right now. But I'm curious what conversations you've had, if you've secured support, or just, whatever you'd like to share at this point. But I also want to flag that as a major question that anyone will have talking about a campaign. Thanks.
This isn't like a statistically perfect like representation, but at the ADC luncheon, we threw this question out to a large swath of Anchorage's business community. We said, do you support Project Anchorage? And I'll share that roughly 75% said yes. A tiny sliver, 20 out of 638 responses said no, and the rest said unsure. So, I mean, that right there, I think, shows that the business community as a whole is very much behind this. And then in terms of any industries that have shown any opposition, I met with some members of the alcohol industry this week who would like to see alcohol exempt. But other than that, they were generally supportive of the proposal. Have you all from your talks heard of anything else you wanted to add to that?
I think Julie and I both have things to add. One of the, so, it's interesting. I hadn't thought about like the Safeways of the world, the Walmarts of the world. One of the things that I think would be an appealing discussion with them is a lot of those companies own their facilities, and they're getting a 20% reduction on their property taxes. And I don't know like the full picture, big balance. We had a representative from the Diamond Mall on our initial 2023 working group. And that representative started off on the opposite side of the spectrum. And this group of people that we put together, it was a full spectrum of people. And so it was very interesting, the process, as people slowly came to the center on agreement on pretty much every single thing, almost unanimously when we finished our process. So I know that that's not like hard data, but we have faith that there's this, exchange for, we know we're doing this. We're hoping that this will ease some of that. But the people that I've come across, it's very small nuances that they're not happy about. It's not the big picture concept.
Great. Anyone else want to add to that?
I'll just add quickly. So yes, at least from my board, which is not the whole industry, but we did discuss, did we want to strongly ask for an exemption to hotels, the room tax, since we're already paying 12% or collecting 12%. The members who represent accommodations on my board did not ask me to come back and ask for an exemption there. We also have representatives from CLIA, Cruise Line Industry Association, on our board. They have been supportive of the process and what currently is being proposed. Overall, there's a lot of support that I see from the industry, but I certainly cannot represent all hotels or anything like that. But it was very, very positive. I think they're excited about investing in the community, attracting and retaining workforce. Those things are very important to the industry right now.
And I'll just briefly say, I think that's just something to flag going forward. You're not going to win everybody, right? But just knowing who your opposition might be and what they're doing is helpful. And also, I will just take this moment to reiterate something that I will keep saying, which is customers paid the sales tax, because I remember having that conversation a lot. Businesses sometimes characterize that they are the ones paying it. If they are paying consumer taxes, they are doing it wrong. And so it doesn't mean that it doesn't have an impact on business, of course, but just to reiterate, we should all remember that it is the customer paying the tax. Thanks.
All right, Zach.
Yeah, thanks. And kind of tying in this conversation we're having here, I feel like it would be useful and informative as you guys continue to engage and pull people, especially in the business community. I mean, you mentioned 75% just very informally looked like they were supportive of it. It'd be nice to dig in a little bit more about what elements specifically they find attractive. I mean, is it that 3% amount that feels like really good to some people? Is it the 2/3, 1/3 split? Is it, as we presented thus far, that 1/3 for improvement-oriented projects? I mean, what about these things do people in the community find like particularly attractive, or if they have concerns about elements, what are those elements? I think it'd be useful to inform our decision-making process, because as Meg pointed out, ultimately, like, we want this to have the support to where if it goes forward, like, we have a campaign that's backed and we don't create something that becomes unpalatable to the business community or the voters. So just, yeah, whatever information you gather there, I think would be very helpful to us.
We were shared the polling data for the alcohol tax, so that might be a place to start. Anyone else for the queue? Otherwise, I'm going to hopefully get us out of here a little bit early. Okay, so what we're going to do is first say thank you. Thank you. You guys have just spent a lot of time and effort working on this, and it's fun and it's exciting to have a new revenue conversation. So thank you for catalyzing that for our community. It will be the first of multiple conversations as the Assembly considers this proposal. We will be asking the administration at the next Budget and Finance Committee meeting how they would like to engage in this conversation with us, because they will be the implementers of any tax. So we will have a timeline hopefully from them as to how they want to engage as well. And that next meeting will be in September, mid-September. If adopted, the sales tax would be the largest reengineering of the municipal's revenue system in decades. So it's important that we take time to ask tough questions, do the research, and really contemplate the impacts as we move through the process. To that end, as this is fresh in your mind, members, I invite you through legislative services to send in questions that we can send wholesale to the coalition and AEDC and get those answers back together, as we're also asking for additional documents. We'll try to do our homework as quickly as possible as well. And with that, everyone have a great weekend. We are adjourned.